Hello, everyone. It's nice to meet you. A little housekeeping before we begin. The closed captioning option has been turned on. If you'd like to use that option, click on the CC icon at the bottom of your screen, and you can choose closed captioning, which will show you the text at the bottom of the screen, or full transcript, which will open a window to the right where the text will appear along with the speaker's name. Additionally, today we have ASL interpretation. If you're using the ASL interpretation, please find the name of the interpreters among the panelists, and you should be able to pin their camera so that you'll see them when they're speaking. The interpreters will switch now and then during the session, so you may wish to pin both or be watching for the switch. So my name is Anna Mena, and I'm a principal with the Trillium Lakelands District School Board. Our team today that's presenting is Jennifer Vieira, who is also a principal with the Durham Peel Catholic, oh sorry, I mixed that up, with the Dufferin Peel Catholic District School Board, and Dr. Christine Sertam, who is a lead researcher with the new math curriculum. Behind the scenes, we have Brad Harris with OPC and Luciana Cardarelli with CPCO. So you've had a probably incredibly busy day, and yet you have enough gas in your gas tank to come here today. And I so applaud you and so thank you, because I know, you know, it is hard to pull that extra bit of effort to learn something new. So are you ready to build something great together with the new math curriculum? Today we'll be highlighting cross-stranding components of effective mathematics classrooms. And it is the intent of our team, and hopefully you feel the same after we're finished, that you come away with some new learning and definitely some very practical things to apply to your schools and the classrooms. All right, let's begin. So we'll start with the land acknowledgement. I'm presenting today from Lindsay, Ontario, and would like to acknowledge that these lands and waters are the traditional homeland of the Ojibwe Nation and the Huron-Wendat Nation, and now includes communities from the Mohawk Nation, the Potawatomi Nation, the Inuit Nation, and the Métis Nation of Ontario. Under the One Dish with One Spoon Treaty, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy and the Anishinaabe peoples agreed to share and care for this territory for the benefit of future generations. We acknowledge their stewardship throughout the ages. I chose this picture as a personal connection to our land. With COVID, I've rediscovered the joy of hiking and feeding chickadees from my hand. It was a childhood pleasure that I shared with my dad and now share with my own children, and I'm sharing it with you too. Please take a moment now to acknowledge the traditional territory that you are situated on. Told you we'd be building something great today. So picture the math curriculum as a tree house. In order to build a tree house, we need long-range plans, and those affect our blueprints. The high-impact instructional practices are similar to the trunk of a tree. It brings the math curriculum to new heights and also provides a stable foundation for the treehouse. Cross-stranding is similar to weaving beautiful colors and tapestry together. Mathematical modeling is when you put your hard hat on and you do the hard work of actually building it together. And then finally, assessment and evaluation is similar to taking a snapshot of the process of building a treehouse, seeing where you are and the steps you need to take to get where you want to go. Simon Sinek often tells us to start with why. So why is there cross-curricular and integrated learning in mathematics? Well, by purposefully drawing connections across all areas of mathematics and to other subject areas, and by applying learning to relevant real-life contexts, teachers extend and enhance student learning experiences and deepen their knowledge and skill across disciplines and beyond the classroom. You ready to look at those blueprints? Well, let's look at the long-range plans. So the ministry long-range plans are examples. They're dynamic documents, samples that include all curriculum expectations. They're also a reflective document and a prioritization of student learning. What they are not is a mandatory document. And that being said, we do recognize that some boards have made them mandatory for this year. They're not a static document, nor a recipe book. So where do you start? Well, let's explore the Ministry of Education's sample long-range plans together. You can either click on this link, or if you wish to go to the math curriculum website, you can find the link on the blue tabs at the top, or scroll down to the bottom on the right where you can find a list of quick links. What you'll find are sample long-range plans that are offered by question, by topic, and also Niagara and Simcoe have shared their district school board's scope and sequence. Although the idea of long-range plans developed by questions or topic might feel uncomfortable to some teachers or administrators, perhaps as we unpack, explore, and play with, and break down the actual plans, cross-strand plans will look more achievable. As leaders, if we take learning and curiosity stance, we might help those staff members who are feeling overwhelmed with the revised math curriculum and hesitant to start. So we can see that the long-range plans are organized by questions, and those are typically month-long units. They're also organized by topics, which may take from 10 to 30 days. And then, of course, once again, Niagara and Simcoe's mathematics scope and sequences are provided. When we look at the long-range plans by topic, I'm pulling up the grade 4, 5, and 6, some samples anyways. What do you notice in the junior grades? If you don't mind just taking a few minutes to share what you've noticed in the chat box, then we can discuss and share those ideas.
Thanks for that, Anna. And as some thinking starts to come into the chat room, Brad, I want to thank you for posting the link to the long-range plans. A couple of people have mentioned that they had trouble getting in. I have tried the link and it has taken me there, so maybe just give it another try. Maria, you've just shared that there are big ideas across the grades. Thank you. There's consistency that appears across the grades, and it appears to be in a continuum of learning. Math is a process and not a product. Thank you, Manaz and Maria. Anyone else, any thinking there? That there are multiple entry points, absolutely. And Anna, as other ideas come in, I'll kind of jump in as I can, if that's okay.
Sounds fantastic. Let's take a look at the long-range plans by question. So here we've just posted February, March, April, and May's questions for grade 4, 5, and 6. What do you notice here? Please put your comments in the chat box.
They're very open-ended questions. Thanks, Tracy. Karen has noticed that the questions prompt problem solving. They're investigative in nature. Thank you, Susanna. That higher order thinking skills and inquiry-based kind of learning seems to be embedded here. Thanks, Manaz. The opportunity that allows students to see connections across separate strands, so math is broader. An interesting observation. Thanks, Karen. That questions get students to think about their own processes and action steps. That's from Nicole and Manaz, that this presents a more of a holistic view of math. Some great observations. It shows the possibility for cross-curricular connections as well. Again, Anna, if you're ready to move on, I'll bring forward any ideas that pop up as well.
Sounds phenomenal. Thank you. So the next question is, what do we do as principals to leverage that information, to leverage what we've noticed in the junior grades? Please share your ideas in the chat box.
It's a great question, because at the heart of all of this, of course, is our role as leaders in terms of moving all of this forward in ways that benefit our kids, of course. Someone made a comment that the questions we see here are very applicable to real life. They're that open. I know in working with a staff, taking the last two charts that were shown and running through an exercise like this with the junior division might be an excellent way to bring forward leadership in math. And Anna, could you repeat the question again, please? It's been a long day for everyone.
It has been for everyone. Absolutely. How can you leverage what you notice in the junior grades as a principal?
Kelly has shared, although junior, many of the questions with reading comprehension, with small adaptations are applicable to primary and intermediate as well. Isn't that interesting? And Vicki shares that division-wide focus, as was done in literacy, specifically reading comprehension skills, to see how math is connected throughout the grades. And some clarification, what do you mean by leverage, Anna?
Oh, excellent question. So leverage, how could you apply this in terms of being a principal? What you've noticed, how do you apply it in terms of talking to staff, working with staff, and helping them discover the long-range plans?
Nicole shares that you could put an emphasis on using questions to get an educator and student understanding, the notion that we're learning together. Rashma offers that in noticing that number sense and numeration is embedded throughout all the big questions, we need to build capacity in staff with that particular strand. And Maria shares operational content learning. Is this what you mean, as a further clarification? And as you mull that, Anna, Tracy shares providing opportunities for students to see themselves represented in the curriculum and supporting staff with this. Susanna offers focus on student voice and student learning versus teacher as imparting information. And Manaz shares, it seems like a forum here for math to be applicable in diverse scenarios and classes. I would think opening conversations about math applicability to all spaces. Math is fun when engaged into active making processes.
So thank you for those ideas. I so appreciate them. And I think some of the questions or some of the ideas I'm very excited that you'll see them expanded upon later on in our webinar. So let's take a look at grade 5 and the specific question of when are different operations useful. So here we can see that we dive into number, algebra, spatial sense, and financial literacy as strands for this question. So students are asked to represent types of addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. They're asked to look at relationships between operations, write and solve algebraic equations, area and perimeter problems, and conversion between metric units, translation on Cartesian planes with scales, and total cost and coding operations. That's a fair amount for just one question. And coming back, and I think obviously I'm presenting with experts, so thank you for being part of the group that's sharing today. Some of you asked the same questions that are in the ministry document. So here are some possible reflective questions to ask teachers when planning long-range plans. What key concepts, models, and strategies do students need more time to develop? Does a long-range plan revisit expectations later? If not, how might the plans be adjusted so it does? What prior learning is assumed in order for other expectations to be addressed? And how can you create opportunities for students to continue to practice and consolidate learning when they're engaged in new learning? Perhaps you can see yourself asking these questions in a staff meeting or a division meeting. Perhaps you already have. These are just some questions to leverage the learning that is happening in your schools. The other key leadership move that we can consider is how we provide time and space between meetings to continue the conversations. So with that question, perhaps you can share some ideas, things that you might consider doing in terms of providing time and space between meetings to continue the conversations with your teachers. And I think this is a huge question, especially given the restrictions and parameters we have with COVID in our schools and online. Please share your ideas in the chat box.
We offered this same webinar for the primary division on Monday, and the creativity that came out in this particular section of the webinar was astounding, especially with the adaptations for the virtual environments that many of us find ourselves in. So we have Claudia offering that using staff collaborative documents, and of course, shared platforms like Google or Office definitely can support us in all of that. That really reinforces that notion that all of this is evolving and growing as we do. We've got lots of ideas coming in, collaborative learning modules with the team, such as Moodle/Google Classrooms, PowerPoint, Prezis. Co-sharing ideas would be key to keeping things innovative. Creative timetabling. One person on our staff got an extra period in a 5-day cycle to take the lead for the junior grades. Collaborating to try new things, assignments, and plans. If there are set times for collaborative inquiry, use such and school Google Drive. Using student voice as the matter for a vehicle. Not sure if this was already asked. Will the recording be shared? Yes, absolutely. The recordings will be shared. So don't make the stress of note-taking be too heavy on you, of course. All of the resources will be shared with you. That's been part of our impetus with all of the work with respect to this math project. You can go to your association website and you'll find a page on the new math curriculum, and everything is available there. That idea of connecting collaborative inquiry for making space in between, I think, is extraordinarily powerful.
Thank you for sharing, everyone. Those were phenomenal ideas, and obviously some phenomenal work that's already happening in your schools. And sometimes just a simple question towards a teacher is saying, you know, during our last staff meeting, you mentioned that you wanted to dive deeper into whatever the topic may be. And then just asking, how can I help you with this? It's just the reaching out, the opportunity to revisit some ideas as we work together towards playing and discovering the new math curriculum and the long range plans.
And don't forget the wonderful resources that the ministry has also developed, and modules also through the math associations.
So just as the trunk of a tree provides stability and anchors the tree, we're going to keep with the tree metaphor and move into the area of high impact instructional strategies. So high impact instructional practices provide stability for the curriculum. So if you could advance the slide, Anna. We wanted to highlight this component of the 2020 math curriculum. It is a document you'll find through the math link called High Impact Instructional Practices. If Anna, you could bring in the next few items. This document is a very succinct document that lists 9 different high impact instructional practices. You'll likely recognize many of them as these are solid research-based components of a rich mathematics classroom. This document provides 1 to 2 pagers for each of these 9 items. They're really useful, simple, easy to look at components which could help you to easily facilitate a learning conversation with a teacher. And some of the things they can help you to focus on would be what are any of each of these 9 areas? What are they about? What are they? What do they look like? What do they look like in our classroom? And what might we use them? So really good references for conversations with teachers. And if you could go to the next slide. For this next section, we're going to focus on the area of direct instruction as a useful high impact instructional practice. And we're going to talk about it just as an example in the context of cross-strand mathematics. So again, there's 9 components and the direct instruction is just one, but it's definitely one worth spending a little bit of time on and thinking about. So I will pose another question to you and have you do some thinking. So what do you think of when you hear the term direct instruction, or what do you think people might think of? What comes to mind? If you could put a few ideas in the chat, that would be great.
Lecture styles, special education IEPs and accommodation. Antoinette, welcome. Glad to have you here. Teacher-led's another comment. Modeling, note-taking, explicit instruction, intentional, Socratic, clear learning goals.
Great. So you'll see that there's quite a diverse range of ideas that come to mind. So we're going to talk a little bit about what direct instruction is. I want to reference for you here, though, and you can look at this later, but in the chat, we're going to give you a link to a fabulous ministry video. It's called Explicit Teaching in Problem-Based Mathematics. Really loved it, very short to the point, great video to use with staff, and it helps you to look at direct instruction, also known as explicit instruction, as something that's a key component of a problem-based learning math program, as opposed to seeing it as a very separate pedagogical approach to teaching math. So, and if you could move to the next slide, let's build on some of those ideas that you've shared. And talk about what it is and what it is not, because you will hear a lot of different ideas around what direct instruction is, and it's actually quite sophisticated. So I'm going to start with what it's not. So I saw a lot of these in the chat as well. Lecture style is often an idea that's thought of when you hear direct instruction. Teacher talking up front of the class, we hear that one a lot. The teacher imparting of knowledge or reading from a textbook, or sometimes the teacher talking and then kids working. So the teacher being the lead is definitely an idea that comes to a lot of people's minds when you hear about direct instruction. So let's talk a little bit about what it is. And these are the pieces that you can use the document fact sheets to help pull out some conversations with staff. So it is explicit instruction because it is very intentional teaching. So it's very concise, it's very precise, so it requires a lot of careful planning on the part of the teacher. It requires the teacher to develop an understanding of what are some of the curriculum continuums that I'm thinking about when I'm thinking of the math I'm teaching to my students. What is some of the content knowledge that I need to know so that I can anticipate student ideas. You need to do some explicit planning around learning goals, success criteria, and thinking about what kinds of feedback you'll be giving students, and not only connecting to learning goals, success criteria, but how am I going to connect the feedback specifically to the student thinking? Maybe the students will say what I think they might say. Maybe I don't know what they're going to say, and I have to think about how I'm going to approach that. So you can see it's quite a sophisticated piece. It also involves constantly checking for understanding with your students as you're going through your math. It's a lot of clarifying. It involves a lot of modeling. The teacher often names the mathematics. That's an area sometimes where our students don't know the words to describe the mathematical ideas. So we explicitly name it for them. We help to explain or help to pull out their thinking and start with where the students are. And also after all that, it often includes, a strong, clear summary on the part of the teacher to help capture what it is that the class has learned. So you can see there's a lot of components, and it's quite a bit to think about. So it's a really important piece to think about in the math classroom, and it's been around for a long time. It is something that's not new. So it's definitely a conversation we want to continue to have with our teachers. So Anna, if I could ask you to move to the next slide, I'm just going to go through just an example, a junior example to kind of talk through this idea. So suppose you are a teacher who's looking to explore the topic of fractions, and I'm going to ask my class to look to explore a variety of book genres, and I'm going to present them a problem that asks them to explore something that I planned related to fractions. So for example, teacher comment here says there are half as many comic books as there are biographies. How many books of each genre could there be, and how do you know? So it's a very open-ended question, which would allow for multiple entry points. And you can see some very clear connections to the number strand, which is looking at fractions. But as a teacher, just by adding an additional question, by looking at doing some planning and looking at the connections across strands, it would allow you to probe into another area. So for example, the question I have here, what if you probed further with kids? What if our librarian, Mrs. Ferez, chooses to randomly distribute books to our class? What is the likelihood that you will receive a comic book? And explain your thinking. So you can see that now this dialogue is tapping into highlighting areas of probability. This is a grade 4 example, and it's an opportunity to explore probability language here. So this doesn't happen by accident. So you can see the intentionality that's required here. So with very careful planning, with the teachers not developing some knowledge around the pedagogical content knowledge, you'd have to have the strategic use of questioning to think about when to bring the question in. You can see that you can address multiple concepts, and you can definitely have an opportunity to pull out a richer understanding of mathematics as opposed to looking at it in a very isolated way or through separate concepts. So if you could move to the next one. So lots of information there around the idea of direct instruction. So thinking just about yourself, you can start to reflect a little bit about where you can start with this concept if this is something you're going to move forward. So as a principal or vice principal in your school, you want to definitely start where your teachers are. And in order to do that, you need to know where they are. So do your teachers, where are they when it comes to direct instruction? So if you think about that question and you can answer the question, and maybe your answer might be, yes, I think I know that my teachers are exploring direct instruction and they're at that place and you're going to go into it further, then great. Maybe you're going to further explore this topic. You can use some of those fact sheets that I referenced from the document. Maybe you're going to start to go into this by clarifying some misconceptions because they already know what direct instruction is and you need to now clarify some misconceptions, or maybe you want to choose to go deeper, unpacking one specific area that I referenced earlier and do a little bit of learning there through a PLC, for example. If you're not sure how to answer that question, so if you think about your staff and think about where are they when it comes to direct instruction, do they know what it is? And you don't know what the answer is, then that is your starting point. So the question is now going to be, so how am I going to find out? So maybe that's going to involve you thinking about how you can spend some time visiting some classrooms. And I know for sure it's about, in this time, it's kind of about giving ourselves permission because we're very inundated right now and very busy with a lot of things that are going on. So how do I give myself permission to do some classroom visits? How do I engage and do some classroom visits online with my kids who are learning virtually? Maybe I need to just have some conversations with some teachers and probe some thinking and find out where their thinking is around direct instruction. Maybe I need to do a teacher survey, or I'm going to create some PLCs and start to explore through conversations in small groups. So regardless of where you are, it's about just finding a spot to begin and then just start to take the next step. And again, any of the 9 areas of the high impact instructional practices are well worth exploring.
And so I'm just going to take a couple of moments just to re-emphasize the reason why we talk about cross-strand teaching. Well, for starters, you can see even from these tapestries that when we cross the strands or when we weave things together, it makes for such a richness in what we're looking at. And it also helps to develop, when we think about mathematics, we develop that richness in our students and that depth of understanding. So if we kind of keep that metaphor in mind, I think that really helps. So on the next slide, we have, and I'm going to go through several different quotes that are actually in the curriculum document in the front matter or the context. They say over and over again the importance of making connections between related math concepts, between math and other disciplines, and math and everyday life. This is really based on research that talks about the idea that students develop a deeper understanding of math concepts when they actually see it represented in different ways and when they can start to connect those different representations. So when students start to see a math concept appear when they're doing an activity that's around measurement, or when they're doing it around patterning in algebra, or when they're doing it in financial literacy, they start to see how that mathematical idea is represented in different ways, as well as, of course, in everyday life and in connecting it with other disciplines. The next slide really talks about the idea of a robust mathematics curriculum. So again, I think of that robustness in terms of those tapestries that were so colorful. But again, this reiterates the idea of making connections to experiences, mathematical concepts, and other situations. But for me, some of the most important language in this quote is about this learning towards the end enables all students to gain a powerful knowledge of the usefulness of the discipline. So what I think about when I see that is I really think about allowing the students to develop a sense of themselves as a mathematics learner, an identity as a mathematics learner. I actually think Tracy, previously in the chat pod, when we were talking about something else, said that really we should be providing opportunities for students to see themselves in the mathematics. And that's really what it's all about when we're talking about making connections between math concepts, but also to the kinds of everyday experiences that students have. And if we look at the next quote, again, this is a long one, and this also starts to talk about connections. But here it really is about talking about the way we use mathematical processes to help us make connections, and the way we make connections between the mathematical processes, so that we see mathematics not as a set of isolated skills or an isolated set of processes or an isolated set of topics, but we're able to see the coherence of it. So when we think about the mathematical processes, and they're the same ones that were in the 2005 curriculum, they didn't go away, they're still there, because that's the way that we learn mathematics. We think about problem solving, making connections, selecting tools and strategies, reasoning and proving, all of those kinds of mathematical actions that help students make those connections between those mathematical concepts. And then if we go to the next slide, I think I'm going to be handing it back to Anna, who's talking about mathematical modeling, but I'm also going to give you a heads up that I'm going to be back again because I want to be able to talk about assessment and that idea of one report card mark. So over to you, Anna.
Thanks so much, Christine. You've probably come to this webinar with some ideas as to what mathematical modeling is and isn't. So let's take a look. We'll put our hard hats on and do the real work associated with it. So what is mathematical modeling? Well, when we look at the overall expectation, it's the same for grades 1 all the way through 8. And it's applying the process of mathematical modeling to represent, analyze, make predictions, and provide insight into real life situations. You'll notice that there are no specific expectations for mathematical modeling. Students need to demonstrate the process of mathematical modeling, and it's the process that's assessed and evaluated. This may be a little bit different than the way that we've been looking at things. So what is this process? Well, mathematical modeling provides authentic connections to real life situations. The process starts with an ill-defined and often a messy real-life problem that may have different solutions that the child or student can come up with. And in fact, all those solutions may be correct. Mathematical modeling requires the modeler to be critical and creative and make choices, assumptions, and decisions. Teachers should be culturally aware of the choices of mathematical modeling questions they pose, and students create a variety of different models based on their own experiences. The curriculum context document states that culturally reflective and responsive teachers know that there are more than one way to develop a solution. Students are exposed to multiple ways of knowing and are encouraged to explore multiple ways of finding answers. For example, an Indigenous pedagogical approach emphasizes holistic, experiential learning, teacher modeling, and the use of collaborative and engaging activities. So, what might it look like? Well, when we look at understanding the problem, the students need to know what questions need answering and what information is needed. As leaders, as principals going into a classroom, we may see whole class discussion or small group brainstorming occurring. Analyzing the situation requires students to determine what assumptions they've made about the situation and what changes and what remains the same. Here you may see small group brainstorming to determine information, how information is to be gathered, assumptions to be made, and so on. And please note that this is not a linear process. So once we're analyzing the situation, it is quite possible that students need to go back to understanding the problem or moving forward to create a mathematical model. Creating that mathematical model really involves doing the mathematics. So students are gathering data, measuring, drawing, graphing, organizing, and so on. And they put this all together. Once they've created that mathematical model and determined what tools and technologies and strategies they need and what concepts and skills might be involved, they might determine or need to go back to analyzing the situation, or they may be prepared to go forward and analyze and assess the model. So when they're analyzing and assessing the model, the student needs to determine if this model provides a solution to the problem and perhaps some alternative models that are available. It involves stepping back to see if our model solves the problem and sharing the model with other groups. The feedback determines whether there needs to be some refinement, or if there's an oops and we need to go back to understanding the problem, analyzing the situation, or creating a different mathematical model. As I said before, this process is indeed messy and nonlinear. It's important to notice that the process of mathematical modeling is different than the one mentioned in the 2005 math curriculum. In the 2005 curriculum, the process was describing a relationship using mathematical or physical representations. So the mathematical representation of a squared plus b squared equals c squared is no longer considered mathematical modeling in this curriculum, and neither is taking a cake and dividing it into fractions. The process of mathematical modeling should not be confused with using a model to represent or solve a problem that does not require the whole process. So what does it look like in terms of a task? Let's take a look at two different questions. How much does it cost to have a pet? As compared to if a bag of food for a hamster costs $10 for a month, how much will it cost to feed it for a year? When we apply the criteria, we can determine whether or not each question is an appropriate mathematical modeling question. So we ask ourselves, is this a real life situation? In this case, I would say yes, both are real life situations. Then we start to get some differentiation. Can students use the process of mathematical modeling for both of these questions? Does this question require research? Is there room for students to decide which sub-questions to explore and which to ignore? And then finally, does the question target expectations from various strands? You've probably already determined in your head that the last 4 questions only apply to how much does it cost to have a pet, and they don't apply to the second question. What I love about the first question and what's key in terms of making it a mathematical modeling question is that there's so much variability. Students need to determine what cost really means. What is its definition? Does cost only mean monetary? Does it involve the cost of time to take your pet for a walk or to feed it, or the cost required to provide a cage, or the cost required to take care of the pet if the family isn't home? And then what is the definition of pet? Is it a potbelly pig? Is it a gecko? Is it a cat or a dog? All these questions require research, and it allows the student to decide which questions they wish to explore and which ones they're not interested in exploring. So creating the tasks really is the work of the teachers, and our leadership task is to ask ourselves how we guide teachers in creating quality mathematical modeling tasks. So some considerations for you as we stumble and work our way through this first run. Biggest one is to start slowly and build. Take a word problem and ask yourself, what is the underlying problem? In the previous example, the word problem was $10 for a bag of food for a hamster. And really, the underlying problem is, how much does it really cost for a pet? It's a way to expand and make a regular question into a mathematical modeling task. Also consider that we need to recognize that the 4 components of mathematical modeling need to be taught explicitly. Students are not equipped to do this inherently or just by instinct. We need to teach it directly. Another consideration is to explore the expectation from other subjects such as science and technology, social studies, geography, and other subject areas. And that way we can create cross-curriculum opportunities. You may wish to consider using mathematical modeling as a culminating activity, and definitely consider equity, engagement, and inclusion in the creation of your questions. If you'd like to find out more about mathematical modeling tasks, I highly recommend watching the webinar provided by the OAME found on this link. It is exceptional.
So as promised, I'd like to talk a little bit about assessment and evaluation. We will be talking about sound classroom assessment, and then we'll be talking in more detail in terms of the report card and evaluation. So just a few things I want to review in terms of sound classroom assessment. I suspect that most of you know it, but it doesn't really hurt to hear it. So we know, obviously, it's in curriculum documents, it's in all of the research, that sound classroom assessment should be used to improve teaching and learning. We also know that it's ongoing and embedded in instruction. So in other words, it's not an event at the end of a unit, it's not a test that appears at the end of the unit. It occurs moment by moment as teachers are making decisions, are asking questions, are listening to student responses, and are responding. I think actually I really liked how Maria said earlier in the chat pod something about math is a process, not a product, which really also relates to assessment, because that's the whole idea. We need to pay attention to it all the time, not just kind of an end product. That goes along with the using a variety of assessment strategies. So using a variety of assessment strategies, we know that it honors things like that the students show their learning in different ways. We know that students need multiple opportunities to show their learning, but the one thing we often don't talk about is the reason we use or should be using a variety of assessment strategies is because one assessment method will not capture the breadth of all of the mathematical actions that occur in a classroom. If I look at the curriculum expectations, some of them might be about doing a calculation, which could be assessed with a paper and pencil task, but others are about students creating or communicating or justifying or demonstrating, and those are not necessarily things that are best assessed with paper and pencil tasks. They could be through observation or conferencing. We know that it needs to be aligned with curriculum and instruction. And so I'm thinking about things like if students are working on a problem-solving task and they're working in groups, then does it really make sense to assess the problem solving by putting them in individual seats? No, what we might want to do instead is have them do some brainstorming on the problem that we're using as our assessment task, brainstorm together and then move apart and jot down their own thinking. So it also should be focusing on what's important about the subject. Sometimes people use assessments that are easy to use, but quite often when an assessment is easy to use, it actually is not assessing what's most important to be looking at. So in other words, if we're using assessments that are looking at low-level tasks, we're telling the students that that's what's important, whereas we know that actually things that are much richer is really what's important about mathematics. And we have to think about ways to assess that, because to students, what we assess is to them what's important. And of course, we have to include the students in the assessment process. It's not about doing assessment to them, it's about doing assessment with them so that they're partners in that process. Next slide, please. So that's sound classroom assessment, but I know that there are a lot of dilemmas about, well, what do we do about moving to one report card mark? And, you know, in a sense, having those multiple report card marks for math almost encourage teachers to teach in silos rather than to teach by integrating those strands. So in a sense, this is kind of a move away to help teachers be able to integrate that. So if we go to the next slide, I just want to highlight a few policy documents. So one is on the website that has the new math curriculum, is an addendum to Growing Success. And I've highlighted and read some of the important things I want to talk about, that there will be a letter and grade percentage mark, letter or grade percentage mark that best reflects the overall learning of the student in mathematics. My guess is you've been through a reporting period already, so you've kind of had to confront this idea, and that really consideration should be given to students' integrated learning across the strands that are taught in each reporting period. And if we look at the next slide, it's referring specifically to the Growing Success document, which talks about the evaluation, focusing on the student's achievement of the overall, and teachers assessing the overall by looking at the specifics and which ones would be most relevant. It also talks about teachers using their professional judgment. So the question is, what does this really look like? Because ultimately what we're doing is we're assessing achievement of the curriculum expectations that are addressed during that period. So sometimes, next slide, I like to look at a big picture of what those expectations look like. So I've just made this simple little chart that has the strands across the top. It doesn't have the social emotional learning strand because that strand we've been instructed doesn't need to be assessed yet. But under each of those strands, things like B1, B2 refer to the overall expectations. And I've put some words there that indicate that what those overall expectations are about. For instance, under number, there are some that are about developing a number sense, and B2 would be about using operations with numbers. So if I think about that as kind of like, okay, my big picture, it's to me a conceptual map. It's not necessarily something physically I would use. And then if I go to the next slide, I can see I'm looking at those dots not as levels. I'm actually looking at each of those circles as a particular assessment evidence from a task or an assessment opportunity that the teachers afforded the students. So for instance, the circle that has a number 1 in it, you see that that's appearing in 2 places. It's appearing under spatial sense and it's appearing under number. So perhaps that represents an assessment task where maybe the teacher had the students do a measurement activity. Maybe they were measuring to find the perimeter of the classroom or finding the area of the classroom or objects around the room. But at the same time, the teacher was getting a sense of their number sense, even in terms of whether they could choose what numbers might come between, getting an estimate as to what they thought it might be, so that maybe that assessment task covered more than one overall expectation and they were collecting evidence. Or for instance, the circle that has a 2 in it, we notice it's under algebra in the patterning, overall expectation, and in operations. So maybe the students were working with patterns and they came up with the general rule of, oh, the rule is times 3 plus 1. And then the teacher might say, okay, so what might that look like for the 10th? How many would there be for the 10th item in this series? How many might there be for the 50th? So they're now using their operational sense to actually do some of those calculations. Now, obviously there would be more than just a dot on the page. So in other words, this is just representing the categories that the evidence would be collected in. But as evidence, the teacher might have notes, they might have given it a level. They certainly would have the date because they'd want some sense of being able to think about, so how is the student developing over time? Do I have a more recent assessment, which would give me better information to use for the report card? So that's a bit of a picture. And now on the next slide, I'm going to kind of use the idea of that modeling task or tasks that Anna talked about to think about, okay, what would I do with the information I might gather from a modeling task? So I'm going to ask you to just really quickly, we talked about how much does it cost to have a pet? We talked about which is the better car to buy. So I would like you just to type in, what are some mathematical ideas that might emerge as students were calculating that? So for instance, I might think about, if we're talking about cost, financial literacy, but there are many other things. So think back to those strands I just showed you and what might be some mathematical ideas that came up. So I'll give you a minute to type in there because I want to hear some of your responses. So the math ideas that might arise in those modeling tasks. Kind of scary if no math ideas came up. Great, okay. Financial literacy, inquiry, group work, art, music. So a lot of connections outside, great. Outside of mathematics as well. Taxes, interest, percentages. So a lot of calculation with numbers, proportional reasoning, thinking about some of those things. I think about proportional reasoning, they have to decide on the size of this pet, and that might have something to do with how much food I need to buy. The driving, the speed, talking about the car one, so even rates, cooking, temperatures. Great. Making connections to their prior knowledge, connections to life, multiple entry points. Spatial sense, great. Okay, you've got tons of ideas. So let's think about in a minute, what are other ideas? So the teacher could gather some assessment data around some of these math concepts, but the teacher also needs to be gathering some assessment data around the process of mathematical modeling, because they're assessing that as well. So these are some of the mathematical ideas that you mentioned that would come up. So estimating, calculating, building a budget, measuring. But you can also see I have bolded there the idea of mathematical modeling, because that is an overall expectation. So I also need, as a teacher, to be able to gather information about that. And so if I go to the next slide, I would want to be able to think about how might I assess that mathematical modeling process? So what are some ideas? Well, I could have various checkpoints along the way where I touch base with each group, maybe through observation, conversations. Maybe they give me written submissions as to what they're doing along the way. There might be some self and peer assessment where they're comparing their models to one another's models and they're noting the differences between them. Or it might be a matter of, oh, gee, I never thought of that. So they might go back and refine their model. Or maybe towards the end, I have the students produce a portfolio. And so they come and meet with me as a teacher. And what they have in there is all of kind of their rough work. And then they present to me, so what's in the model you came up with and how did you come up with that? So that's the idea. I also have to assess that mathematical modeling process. And now on the next slide, you can see that I'm kind of putting all that together. So this was the form where I had some of those circles that represented different assessments I might have collected, but perhaps I did that mathematical modeling task and I now have new assessment data. And I noticed that somebody in the chat pod mentioned some of the coding and that's maybe I was doing some, maybe the students were doing some coding and creating their mathematical modeling. So I now have all of those kind of rust colored stars, which might represent, oh, I've got new assessment data for some of those overall expectations as well from doing this cross-stranded activity. And, you know, for every student, it might not be data in the same places because it might have to do with how they actually approach the problem. I've seen, for instance, some rich tasks I've given where some students approached it using algebraic reasoning, others approached it using proportional reasoning. So it's hard to predict what's going to come up. And then of course, you know, all you see are dots and stars now, but behind each of those, as I said before, is the data and the information a teacher would need to be able to put that all together. And so in the next slide, we make reference to professional judgment because we know that growing success is that teachers will be using their professional judgment. And I think as leaders and administrators, we need to think about how can we help to provide learning opportunities to teachers to enhance their understanding of sound instruction and assessment, and ultimately to enhance their professional judgment, to think about what are ways that we can help teachers have those conversations about what does that mean to take this set of data and how can I make sense of that and think about what that means in terms of a report card mark or feedback to students and feedback to parents. And so now I'll turn it back to, I don't know, is it Anna?
Me.
There you go. Jen? Okay, thanks.
Thank you so much. So we hope that you found this webinar useful and maybe we've inspired you with some ideas in terms of a next step for you to think about back at your own school. But we did want to highlight for you some dates for some upcoming professional learning networks that we have coming up. We do encourage you to attend, and registration does stay open until the day of. So we encourage you to take part in that. And if you could go to the next slide, also wanted to bring your attention to our live Google Doc resource document. Here are a few of the links that were shared with you today in the chat, but you will also be receiving an email following this presentation with the PowerPoint as well as our live Google Doc, which has a number of a growing list of resources that you can use to support in a variety of areas as you unpack the 2020 math curriculum. So we encourage you to check back often because it is constantly growing and we are adding new resources onto it. And we will have a few minutes probably to take some questions if you want to start thinking about any questions you might have for anyone before you go. But we do want to let you know that a feedback form will be sent to you as well in the email. And we do appreciate your feedback. We do use it for planning in terms of next sessions that we have. And you will also receive a video link as well.
And if I could just reinforce the importance of the feedback survey, as central staff with the associations, we actually use that information to build our case with the ministry for future funding for projects like this. So your voice is extremely important to us for sure in advancing that work and making future opportunities available to you.
Thank you. So are
Any
there
questions at all from the group? I'm seeing comments around thanks for the resources, of course. The new curriculum, we'll see if we can get that up to you up on this link. Will the material from the Learning X be available elsewhere after August of 2021? I don't have an answer to that. I'm not sure if anyone else does. Thank you so much for your support in all of this, for sure. And I've just gotten the link for the curriculum, and I will put that in the chat right now. Thank you for the comments around, thank you for the comments around it being manageable. That is the goal. Our key interest in putting this work together was to make this leadership focused and something you would be able to take back and use with your staff. Jennifer and Anna, Chris to our interpreters, and of course, Brad, who has been here to support us in our success all the way through. We really want to thank you. To our participants, we thank you for taking the time. We know how busy these days are, and the fact that this is so important to you makes it that much more important to us. We really wish you well this evening. Hope that you have a chance to unplug and relax a little bit, and then the rest of this week, be good to you and your family. Take good care, everyone, and good night. Lots of thank yous, my friends. This session was excellent.
Bye, everyone.
So Chris and Jen, I see you're still here, Brad, and to our interpreters, thank you again. This session was really, really excellent. Thank you.
Thank you. Take care.
Take care. See you, I guess, tomorrow night.
Yes.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Good night,
Okay then.
everybody.
Good night.
Bye-bye.